and thank you so much for inviting me to speak to your wonderful audience. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to mingle with people from all around the world. I have been hearing the introductions, and people are joining us from India, from Greece, from America, and everywhere. And this is a great opportunity to speak to you. We as Palestinians, we have always been feeling that we are unheard, where that people don't know about our struggle. And I believe this is a great opportunity for us Palestinians to talk about our conflict and to let you know an insight about what's going on in the ground. So I have been told that I am asked to talk about the two-state solution. And of course, this is a very, very huge topic. It's like it's the proposed solution for one of the most intractable conflicts in the world. We, the Palestinians, have been suffering for more than 70 years under occupation, under siege, under conflict, and more than 100,000 Palestinians have been killed. 5 million Palestinians have been displaced of their homes and lands for the past 70 years. So it's a huge conflict. It's one of the most inhuman conflicts in the world. And with the solution presented to the Palestinians, the one-state solution or the two-state solution, it's a huge topic that we need to discuss. So today I have a presentation to you, and I want to be as brief as possible. You can always stop me to ask some questions, whatever you feel. So I would like to share screen now. Maybe this one. So can you see my screen? Thank you so much. So today I'm going to talk about the two-state solution and whether the two-state solution is viable or unviable. And then I will try to put my insight on this matter. And of course, I will try to be as neutral as possible, because I don't want to be only like presenting the Palestinian voice without presenting the other argument. But please know that I am not a politician. I'm not affiliated with Fatah or Hamas or any political party, and I don't have any preferences to neither of them. So I'm going to talk as a Palestinian from Gaza who grew up under the occupation and siege. So as I have mentioned before, this Palestinian conflict with Israel has been going on for the past 70 years, and many people, many countries, many organizations have tried to present a solution for the Palestinian and Israelis, but none of them was viable, and we still are suffering as Palestinian people. The two-state solution was presented for the Palestinian for the past a few decades, but unfortunately, none of the initiatives for that have been presented by America or by the European Union or by Palestinians or the Arabs have been accepted. The two-state solution is now preferred solution for the entire international community, including the US, the EU, the Arab States, the United Nations, and even the Israelis and the Palestinians claim that they support us. But in the past 70 years, nobody has been able to make it work. So we are going to discuss why it did not work. And if you just Google the two-state solution is already dead, you will find hundreds of stories and articles explaining why the two-state solution is dead. But unfortunately, until now, everyone is calling for the two-state solution, notwithstanding all the conflict that's happening in Palestine and Israel, and it have never come to a real solution. So if we are going to study the two-state solution, we have to study the background of the Palestinians and the Israelis. In the first picture here in 1947, this was the Israeli and Palestinian lands, what we call Palestine now. And the white dots here were Jewish communities living in Palestine. And please bear in mind that was in 1947. So before that, the numbers of Israeli Jewish Europeans were very, very few than that. By time after the 1948, the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Arab waged a war, and then the Arabs were defeated, and Israel took control of all the white areas in the second picture, which is nearly more than 50% of the Palestinian lands. And then the United Nations proposed a partition plan in which the Palestinians can take the green areas here, the West Bank and Gaza and part of northern Palestine, and the Israelis would take the other areas. But that did not work because the Palestinians and the Arabs refused this plan, saying that it is unjust for the Palestinians because the Palestinians were the majority, and because the Palestinians were expelled from their homes and lands in Yafa and Haifa and Akka and all these white areas. Between 1949 and 1967, the Israelis took control of nearly 78% of the Palestinian land, and the Palestinians were concentrated into two parts within the Palestinian historical land, the West Bank, this part, and the Gaza Strip. And the Israelis settled in all of the white area. And that happened after the war of 1967, in which Israel, before the 1967, and then after the 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and it also occupied Sinai and defeated the Arabs' armies, Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt. In the present time, the Palestinians are concentrated in these green areas, and Israel is taking control of all of the Palestine. And the Palestinians who are living in Gaza Strip and the West Bank are living under military occupation. And this is very important. So the Palestinians right now, they do not have sovereignty over their own lands, and they don't have a clear borders, and neither Israel. Israel did not declare its borders yet. So the Palestinians are living in what a human rights organization is describing an apartheid state. So the Palestinians are living in separated areas in the West Bank, and in Gaza, the Palestinians are living under tight siege for the past 15 years. The PA and Israel have been negotiating peace plans for the past 30 years, but these plans did not work so far. For the past few decades, the Israelis and the Palestinians and the international community have been proposing the two-state solution, in which the Palestinians can live in one state, in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and under an independent state where they have safe and secure borders based on the 67 lines. And then they proposed 3% of lands swap, and Israel would maintain military bases in Palestine. The Palestinian state would be non-militarized, and East Jerusalem would be the capital of Palestine. Refugees have the right to return to new Palestinian state, and Israel would be recognized by the Palestinians as legitimate. All other claims were dropped. This is the proposal of the two-state solution that have been given to both Israelis and the Palestinians. But unfortunately, this two-state solution has never come to power, and the situation escalated day by other. Now, more than 600,000 Israeli Jewish are living inside the West Bank, and the West Bank these settlements are illegal under the international law, under the UN, under the EU, and all the international bodies have denounced these settlements. But Israel continues to build more settlements inside the Palestinian lands of the West Bank and expelling the Palestinians from their villages. Economically and socially, all the Palestinian lands and people are linked to Israel, so they can never have any kind of sovereignty over their own lands. Within the West Bank, there are hundreds, more than 400 checkpoints over all the roads that lead between the Palestinian cities and towns, which make it very hard for the Palestinians to mobilize within their own land, the West Bank. With that, very less possibility for a state is recognized. Now, if you search the Israeli media, you will hear hundreds of quotes from the Israeli leaders. Netanyahu, the previous prime minister of Israel, saying that the Israelis will never withdraw from the West Bank, and they are here forever to stay. And the new prime minister of Israel, Yair Lapid, he was living in one of these illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and he was vouching for creating more settlements in the Palestinian lands. So these settlements are one of the most impediments to the viability of the two-state solution, because Israel is taking more lands from the West Bank day by day, and they are refusing to give up building new settlements or giving the Palestinians access to the lands that are rightfully theirs. Over the past 70 years, there have been many conferences and attempts to unsettle the two-state solution, but none of these worked because of many problems that we are going to discuss now. Why there has never been a two-state solution? First, because a two-state solution, given that the two-state solution sounds fair, but why the Israeli claim the Palestinians have always rejected these plans. So let's examine these concrete obstacles to the two-state solution. There is the Zionist narrative. I'm going to tell you the Zionist narrative, the Israeli narrative to the problem. The Israelis say that their people were originated in Israel and they were driven out. So they're talking about 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. They say that the Israelis, or the Jewish, not the Israelis, sorry, the Jewish people used to live in this land, and this land is all theirs. And of course, this is like many Palestinians say that these Israelis, so I'm not saying my own opinion on this, but many historians say that yes, they were the Jewish people used to live in this land, but at the same time, over the time, many of them converted to Christianity and then to Islam, and many people have fled. But it's irrefutable to say that just because they lived in this land 2,000 years ago, along with the indigenous people who are now the Palestinians, it is irrefutable to say that they have the right to live here. And if this is right, then the Arabs can now claim Spain because they lived in Spain for 700 years. So it would be absurd if the Arabs say that Spain is ours just because they lived there for a few hundred years. So this is what the Palestinians say about this. The Jewish Zionist narrative, they also say that they have been tiny, persecuted people in Europe, and they have learned through painful experience that they cannot depend on others to protect them. They also say that now they have returned to their ancestral lands. The land of Israel is theirs, and all of it. And please remember it. They want to have all of the Palestinian lands as theirs because they think it's their ancestral land. And they say that they want their neighbors to accept the right to exist as a Jewish state. So this is the Israeli narrative. The Palestinian narrative is that the Palestinians say that this is their ancestral land. They have been living there for thousands and thousands of years, Christians, Muslims, and Jews all together. They lived in harmony, side by side, with each other in this land. They're saying also that in Europe, Jews were oppressed, and Christian countries encouraged them to leave Europe and helped them to colonize our country. We are also saying that the European Jews took over, expelling many of us. Of course, we are saying some of the European Jews, not all of the European Jews, expelling many of us, confiscating our property, and creating a Jewish state of Israel, in which Jews right now have more rights, way more rights than the Palestinians, who are the indigenous people of this land. The Palestinians are also saying that they are angry with what have been done to them, and these wrongs have to be righted. They also, some of the Palestinians also say that Palestine is theirs and all of it is theirs, and they want to return it, all of it. So, but I would like to talk more about all of it, because right now we have two main political parties in Israel, in Palestine, which is Fatah Party and Hamas Party. And these are the most dominant parties in Palestine. Fatah says that they want to have a state based on the two-state solution, in which the Palestinians can live in the West Bank and in Gaza Strip. And they also recognize Israel right to exist within the historic Palestinian lands. And Hamas now is saying that they agree to the two-state solution based on the borders of 1967. But many Palestinians say that rightfully all of Palestine historically is ours. But right now, no one claims that they want all of Palestine and they want to expel the Israelis from it. They just are calling for a two-state solution in which the Palestinians can live in the West Bank and Gaza, and they want to solve the problem of the refugees who live outside Palestine. So apparently, the two narratives of the two groups are contradicted to each other. And it seems that the two-state solution is unviable because every one of the two parties claim that all of the land is theirs, but mainly Israel, of course. A two-state solution does not meet the aspiration of either narratives. Nor the Palestinian nor the Israelis want a two-state solution. And although they claim that they are accepting it, the Israelis has not been cooperative in this matter, and they have their reasons that I will discuss later. While politicians like Netanyahu and the new Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid and Abbas have been telling the international community they believe in the two-state solution, there have been lots of signs on both sides that dividing Israel and Palestine in two states go against the deepest emotions of both ethnic groups. So one of the most impediments to the two-state solution is a geographical one. So if we look at the map here, Israel is white and Palestine is the pink. Never mind the Golan Heights, which is part of Syria and Israel colonized. There are considerable geographical and demographical obstacles to make the two-state agreement unlikely a solution or sustainable. Why is that? Sorry, geographically, none of the lands is of equal value. So if you look here in the West Bank and in Gaza, if you look at the West Bank, you will find that the West Bank is full of mountains and deserts. And the Gaza Strip is a catastrophic environment. It's very small. It's very, very crowded, and more than 2 million people live in it. The West Bank is very small, and it's mostly high and mostly a desert. It's limited. It has very limited agricultural, industrial potential, and West Bank is in fact landlocked and depend on Israel for access. And there is no way to connect Gaza with the West Bank if Israel is taking all of the land between. Geographically, also, most of the water in the Palestinian territories is very limited, and it flows from the West Bank areas, but it originates from the West Bank areas, but it all flows to Israel, which make the Palestinian territories, meaning the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, has very scarce water, and most of the water will go to the Israeli lands. If we look at these lands, this is the Galilee in Israel, where the Palestinians were expelled from this area, and these Palestinians are now living in refugee camps in Lebanon. And this is a desert in a part of the West Bank. So most of the good lands are now in Israel, and all of the bad lands or the deserts or the heights are in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, which will make the lives of the Palestinians very hard. And of course, we have the problem of Jerusalem. The Palestinians in the two-state solution, it is agreed that the Palestinians will have their capital in East Jerusalem, and West Jerusalem will be the capital of Israel, or will be part of Israel. But there were no defined borders between East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem. And in fact, Israel is now Judaizing most of the East Jerusalem and kicking out the Palestinians from East Jerusalem. And now Israel declared all of Jerusalem, West and East, as the capital of the Israeli state. Demographically, there is also another problem, because if we consider that all of the Palestinians live in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, maybe this would be a viable solution. But the fact is that most of the Palestinians don't live in the West Bank or in Gaza. We have around 3 million Palestinians living in the West Bank and 2 million living in Gaza, but that's not most of the Palestinian people. Inside this red circle, most of the Palestinian and the Israeli population are living. If we are looking at the Israeli Jews, who are 6.5 million people, 5.9 million people live inside the land of Israel, but 500,000 people from the Jewish Israeli live in the illegal settlements in the West Bank. As for the Palestinians, who are 10 million, Point 5 million live in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. 1.5 million Palestinians live inside Israel and they have the Israeli citizenship. And there are 3.7 million refugees, Palestinian refugees, living in Lebanon and Jordan and Syria. These refugees have been expelled from their homes and lands in the war of 1948, and they are still living in refugee camps, and they don't have any status in any of these countries. So what do we need? What does the Jewish state, the Jewish Israeli need, and what do the Palestinian need? The Israelis need security and freedom to be Jewish in all of the historic Palestinian lands, and the Palestinians, who are 10 million people, who are the majority, they want the removal of the Israeli occupation in the West Bank and in Gaza. 1.6 million Palestinians who are citizens of Israel need equal rights, and they need not to be discriminated against in Israel, because these Palestinians who live in Israel live under very discriminatory laws, a country that privileges the Israeli Jewish Jews, and it discriminates against the Palestinians. And there are 5.5 million refugees who need a solution. These refugees are scattered around the West Bank and Gaza and Lebanon and Syria and Jordan. They want a solution. They want compensation for their goods taken. They want citizenship. They want equal rights like any people in the world. So now let's talk about the first demand of the Palestinians who are living in under occupation, under military occupation in the West Bank and in Gaza. In the West Bank, the situation is very bad. There are 2.7 million Palestinians living in the West Bank, and there are around 500,000 Israeli Jewish people living in illegal settlements in the West Bank, which makes the lives of the Palestinians very hard. These lands were taken. So these lands in the West Bank were taken by Israel in the war of 1967. Military laws are imposed on the Palestinians who live in the West Bank, and all of the Israelis who are living in the West Bank are linked to Israel, and they have all of their rights. Physically separated from Israel by the wall. So if you look around the West Bank, Israel erected a separation wall that separates the Palestinians from their neighbors in other cities in the West Bank, and also from Israel, which makes their life very hard. And many of the Palestinian lands were confiscated. People were cut off from their neighbors, and students were cut off from their schools. And in these areas, also the Palestinians are very densely populated in these areas, which makes their life very, very difficult. Here are some pictures of the West Bank checkpoints. This is how the Palestinians are treated every day when they go to work. They have to be in lines in order to go to another city or another village. And the Israelis are erecting hundreds of checkpoints within the West Bank. It's a very difficult situation for the Palestinians in the West Bank, and they have to go through this every day. If we look at the Gaza, of course, now the population of Gaza is 2 million, not 1.8 million. Sorry for this mistake. But the people in Gaza are living a very, very harsh situation. They have been living under siege for more than 15 years. There have been very restricted movement on the goods and people. People can't travel outside of Gaza, and goods can't enter Gaza. Israel surrounds Gaza from the land and the sea and the air. There is total lockdown. Unemployment is soaring. 80% of the Palestinian youth in Gaza are unemployed. And the UN said that Gaza will be unlivable by 2020. And we are in 2021. And the situation is very, very difficult. We have to talk for hours about the situation in Gaza. So if we want to talk about the Palestinians who live as citizens in Israel, they are very discriminated against, because Israel considers itself as a Jewish and a democratic state, but it gives more right to the Israelis. But we have to be aware that the citizens of Israel have equal citizenship rights, but in fact there are very discrimination against the Palestinians in terms of housing, education, employment, economic subsidies, social amenities, and many other rights. If we see here, according to the Israeli Jews who live in Israel, they think that the Jews should have more rights than the Palestinians. Here is an article on the Times of Israel saying that nearly half of the Jewish Israelis want to expel the Arabs from Israel. So even the Arabs are not feeling comfortable in their lands because they feel very discriminated against. Now let's talk about the 5.5 million refugees who need a solution. They want a restitution or compensation for goods taken or citizenship. Most of these Palestinians live in Jordan, but this is a distribution of the Palestinians who live in refugee camps in the West Bank and Gaza. In Lebanon, there are nearly 500,000 Palestinians. In Syria, 250,000. In Jordan, there are 2.2 million. In the West Bank, there are 700,000 Palestinian refugees. And in Gaza, 2/3 of the population in Gaza are refugees. This is the life of the Palestinians who live in refugee camps. They are living, and that's in Lebanon. Although they live in Lebanon, not in Israel and Palestine, they have very limited rights. They're discriminated against. They don't have a citizenship. Their movement is very restricted. And they have been living in refugee camps for 70 years so far, and no one given them any solution. So now in Palestine, we have, in order to have any solution, we have 3 problems to solve. The first is the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinians who live in the West Bank, the Palestinians who live inside Israel, and the Palestinians living around in the diaspora as refugees. So any solution we want to propose, we have to solve these problems that the Palestinians are suffering from, all the Palestinians. If a two-state solution won't bring peace, why then does everyone claim to support it? For the Israelis, the peace process there is an ongoing and never-ending peace process, and it is in the interest of Israel, because while it lasts, this peace process, Israel will build more settlements in the West Bank, and they will make the life of the Palestinians very hard. They will control more lands, and they will surround the Palestinians in the West Bank from all the directions. So the peace process, as long as it goes, the number of settlements will grow, the number of settlers inside the West Bank will grow, and it will be harder and even harder for any Palestinian state to be established. For the past 10 years, a never-ending peace process have been the best way to guarantee continuing the U.S. support for Israel as well. But why does the Abbas and the PA support the two-state solution? For them, I think, as a Palestinian, I think they are supporting the two-state solution because it's the only solution that is given to them. It's the only solution that is supported by the EU and by America. And as long as they are supporting, as long as they are clinging to this claim, they will receive the funds that would fund the PA in the West Bank and in Gaza. And because the PA is dependent on foreign aid, it can't just now, if they say they will stop supporting the two-state solution, maybe most of the funds that come from EU and America will stop. So they don't have any choice but to accept the two-state solution. If there is no peace process, negotiations, then there will be no money, and the West Bank and Gaza will be in a very catastrophic situation. So as a summary, I'm sorry if I'm giving you lots of information in a very boring way, but maybe some people don't know this background. So as a summary, Israel right now, after 70 years of occupation, Israel a vibrant modern economy of 6.5 million Jews. Its military and political domination over 10 million Palestinian is almost total. The Palestinians are poor, they're weak, they're divided geographically and politically, and they lack leadership. Israel seems unstoppable in its annexation of the West Bank and Jerusalem. The two-state solution will address the key issues for most Palestinians, but it will leave old fears and hatred in place, guaranteeing continued conflict and misery. So what do we have to do about it? It is time to ask a question. How can we address the legitimate needs of the three groups of the Palestinians while ensuring the security and integrity of the Israelis? We have to agree on some basic principles. The Palestinians are profoundly traumatized psychologically and physically, and Israel claimed that the Israelis are in the same situation, but we don't agree with that. The solution will require a compromise. I believe the solution will require a compromise in which they can both find what they need. A territorial compromise will create two microstates based on religion and ethnicity, leaving fears and resentment in place. Long-term peace and security requires a process for truth and reconciliation, leading to a social and political compromise of mutual respect based on the values of which the world likes to know, which is equality, democracy, human rights, and multiculturalism. So I will conclude here. If there is two-state solution to this issue, apparently it's an illusion, because given all of the reasons that I mentioned before, the two-state solution is supported by some out of naive belief that it would somehow be fair. It will never be fair because it will never solve the problems of the three Palestinian groups, the West Bank and Gaza, people in Israel, and the refugees. It is supported by others out of self-interest, like the Israeli occupation, but dividing the territory into two states, one rich and armed to the teeth, and the other poor, water-starved, overcrowded, and unarmed, will continue to breed resentment, fear, and hostility. It will be a bomb waiting for a moment to explode. The only possible solution, I think, has to come through a compromise of lands, and only dividing, not on dividing the territory, but on equality and civil rights and religious for everyone who is living between the river and the sea. For me, this leaves us only to the one-state solution, in which the Palestinians and Israeli Jews can live in one land between the river and the sea with equal rights for everyone, without segregation, without discrimination between the two peoples. And of course, for many Palestinians and some Israelis, this is an impossible solution. For the Israelis, they will never agree to the one-state solution because they think it's an existential threat to the Israeli Jewish state, Jewish identity. And for the Palestinians, some of the Palestinians think it is unviable because Israel will never agree to the one-state solution, and that's why the Palestinians do not support it. But I believe the two-state solution is both unviable and it is unjust for the Palestinians, and it will never happen because Israel continues to deprive the Palestinians of their land, and they have shown many times that they will never allow the settlements to be dismantled, and they will continue to take more settlements by every day. But I believe that although Israel thinks that one-state solution is an existential threat to its Jewish state, I think we Palestinians and the international community will have to force Israel to agree to this solution, because it's both just and it is viable. Will Israel agree to this? I think they will not, but I think it's time for the international community, for America and the EU, to pressure Israel the way that they pressured South Africa to dismantle the apartheid state in Israel and in Palestine. I think now I finished my presentation. I hope I did not say very dull information to you, but I look forward for the discussion with you. And
thank you so much. That was wonderful. I think there are two things I'd like to mention. This is Jonathan Kitab, Nonviolence International's co-founder, his new book, Beyond the Two-State Solution. It's available on our website, nonviolenceinternational.net, for free. We hope those who've been interested in this conversation dive more deeply into Jonathan's take on why we now need to move beyond the two-state solution, change the conversation so we can change policy and people's lives. And may I ask you to speak a little to We Are Not Numbers, our wonderful partner working in Gaza, and then to your new project?
Yes. So basically, the idea of We Are Not Numbers started after the war in Gaza that took place in 2014. I'm not sure if any of you is familiar with this war, but in this war, it was one of the most severe wars on the Gaza Strip, in which Israel killed more than 2,000 Palestinians, displaced more than 100,000 Palestinians, and destroyed thousands of houses. In that war, I was only 19 years old, and I had a group of friends and my brother. During the times of war, we would always gather and we try to forget the horrors of the war. So we would like to spend more time with each other. So one day, on the 19th of July, 2014, I woke up late and I wasn't with my friends. And then a few hours later, I heard in the news that 6 Palestinians were killed. And for us as Palestinians, we are used to this news. 6 Palestinians were killed, 10 Palestinians were killed, 100 Palestinians were killed. This is a recurring news that we're hearing all the time. So I did not pay attention to these Palestinians. And then when they identified the bodies of the 6 martyrs, they said the names Ayman, Ahmed, Bilal, and this was my brother. And all of my friends were targeted by Israel and they were all killed in one missile. So after that, I was very depressed during the war, and I lost any interest in living and life. And I used to spend most of the time at the graveyard next to their bodies. And I would talk to them, telling them that I want to follow you and I don't want to live in this life. At that time, a friend of mine, an American writer and a journalist, talked to me and she asked me, Ahmed, how do you feel? How are you? And I told her, I'm fine. She said, no, tell me something real. How do you feel? You lost your brother. I told her that I am very depressed. I spend most of my time at the graveyard, talking to my friends and just wishing to die. She said, I should write about it. She asked me to write about it. And I told her, why would I do that? She asked me to write in English. And I told her, why would I do that? No one will care about us. I only lost a brother and a few friends, but other families lost 20 or 30 people in one strike, and the world will not care about us. America and Britain will not care about us because they all think that we're terrorists and whatever. But she insisted, and because she insisted, I agreed to write her a story about my brother and what I felt about losing him. My English was very broken and still broken, but at that time my English was broken a bit. So she helped me edit the story, and she published it in some American publications. To my surprise, I then received many messages from people from around the world saying that they read my story, they were moved by my story, and their heart is with me. And for me, that was a turning point in my life, because I never thought that the West cares about the Palestinians. I never thought that some people care about our stories, about our narrative. But seeing this story, reading these emails from people from around the world gave me a boost. It gave me a purpose to live for, that there is hope, that some people can read our stories, that some people can care about the Palestinians, that the Palestinians can be heard finally. So we came up, Pam and I and the Euromed Monitor came up with this idea. Why don't we create a platform for youth in Palestine to write their stories in English and to expose it to the world? So we started this platform and we called it We Are Not Numbers. The reason why we called it We Are Not Numbers is that because we want to challenge the media perspective about Palestine. We want to tell the human stories behind these numbers. Because for me, my brother was a very integral part of my life. I loved my brother so much, but in the media, it only said that 6 Palestinians were killed. They never mentioned their name. They never mentioned their lives. They never mentioned anything about them. So in We Are Not Numbers, we wanted to tell the world about the human stories that take place in Palestine after the world. So what we did, we replicated the story that happened between me and Pam. And we recruited 20 writers from Gaza who write English, or budding writers, youth, young, and we linked them with international mentors from America and the UK to help them write their stories the same way that Pam helped me write my story. And then we started this project, and we started to publish our stories after the war. The main target, the main mission of We Are Not Numbers at that time was to tell the human stories behind these numbers. And we did a good job. And after that, after we finished writing about, not finished writing about the tragedies, after we wrote much about the tragedies, we developed our story. We said, it's time now to break the stereotypes that are imposed on the Palestinians, that the West have about the Palestinians. We want to write the stories of love, of life, of the beauty of Gaza, of culture, of the Palestinian culture, of the love story, of the talents, of the success. And we wanted to change the stereotypes about the Palestinians. So we recruited more writers, and every 6 months or 8 months, we'd recruit a new batch of writers. Right now, we have recruited more than 300 writers from Gaza. We link them with international mentors and authors from all around the world, in America, in the US, in the UK, in Australia, and from all around the world. We wrote more than 1,000 stories in Gaza and the West Bank and in Jerusalem and in East Lebanon. We also produced many short documentaries about life in Gaza, and we won many international awards on these film festivals. And we published our first book in German. And of course, we write only in English, but at the same time, we are giving any other publications the permission to translate our stories into many other languages. So our stories we translated into tens of other languages: French, Greek, German, and Hindu, and Hebrew, and in every language. And we made sure that the Palestinian voices in Gaza, those who are lived under impoverished life, those who are lived under occupation, those who are deprived of meeting with other cultures from the world, have the chance to meet with the mentors, talk with them, and to write their stories in a way that suits the Western society. And right now we have 6 staffers in Gaza. We have hundreds of mentors. We have hundreds of writers, and we are giving the writers all the tools that they need to write their stories. We're giving them workshops on weekly basis to improve their writing, to get to know the Western community more, and to help them write their stories in a better way. In a better way than they would do without the help of the mentors. And we are targeting only the young writers, the budding writers, not the established writers in Gaza, because these writers or these youth have never been given an opportunity to write in English and to be heard from the world. This is in We Are Not Numbers. In 2019, because by time We Are Not Numbers have become kind of a voice for the Palestinian youth who speak in English, we have been interviewed by hundreds of news organizations around the world to talk about Palestine. And one of them was an Israeli journalist. This Israeli journalist used to work for 972. And he approached me. He wanted to write an article about how the Israeli media, how the Israeli elections affect the Palestinians, given that the Palestinians don't have any choice of choosing the Israeli prime minister, who eventually will affect the lives of the Palestinians directly. So he made this interview with me. And after we finished this interview, I came up with this idea. I told him, one of my dreams is not to write only in English. We want to write also in Hebrew, in order to influence the Israelis who have been misled, who have been receiving misinformation and disinformation about the conflict in Palestine, because all of the Israeli media is dehumanizing the Palestinian and their voices. So the same way that happened with We Are Not Numbers, we came up with this idea, starting a platform in which the Palestinians can write their stories, but in Hebrew. And surprisingly, he wrote a Facebook post on his wall asking for volunteers to translate We Are Not Numbers stories into Hebrew. And we were surprised that more than 150 people agreed to volunteer to translate We Are Not Numbers stories into Hebrew. And then we started to translate these stories, and we have a huge now reach in Israel. After that, we received some funds from French organizations to grow our project, not make it only translations of We Are Not Numbers, but also writing our own content in Hebrew. And this content should be directed directly to the Israeli audience. So now we have some writers who write in Hebrew from Gaza, and we have the Israelis are reading our stories and they are interacting with what we have to tell them. During the last war in Gaza in May this year, we did a magnificent job in the project that we called We Across the Wall, ما وراء الجدار, and more than 1 million Israelis read our stories according to Facebook statistics. And they read our stories. They, for the first time in their life, they say that they are hearing the other side of the story that is against the Israeli media, against what the Israeli media is telling them for the past 70 years. And we have hopes that one day with this project and with We Are Not Numbers, we will raise awareness about the one-state solution in which the Palestinians and the Israelis live in one land between the river and the sea with equal rights in a democracy where the Palestinians and the Israeli Jews can have equal rights. So this is our concept behind establishing this Hebrew project, because we want to raise awareness about the one-state solution. We want them to see the Palestinians as equal human beings, not as subjects or terrorists, because we believe in the grassroots awareness. If most of the Israelis agree to the one-state solution, I think it will be easier for the leaders later to accomplish this one-state solution. And of course, the Palestinians would love to have the one-state solution, but they don't support it now because they think it's impossible. But if one day a viability of a one-state solution is emerged, maybe we can accomplish this. We are young. I'm only 27 years old. I don't have any political affiliation, but we have huge dreams for the future. And I hope with me and with my partners in Israel who believe in the Palestinian rights, and with partners of young leaders from around the world, one day in our lifetime, this conflict can come to end. So I would like to tell you more about my ancestors, my grandfathers, my grandmothers, where they came from, where I live in Gaza. So right now I live in the center. I lived in the center of the Gaza Strip. It's in a city called Deir el-Balah. Deir el-Balah means the city of the palm trees, because we have hundreds of thousands of palm trees in my city, which is amazing. I love my city. But I am not originally from Deir el-Balah. As I have mentioned in the presentation, more than 70% of the Palestinians who live in Gaza are actually refugees. So I am a refugee. My origins came, my father's family came from Jaffa. And Jaffa, sorry, this is, okay. My phone ringing? Sorry. Okay, never mind. So my father's family came from Jaffa. And Jaffa is now Jaffa is close to Tel Aviv. So I'm not originally from Deir el-Balah. My father is from Jaffa. And my mother is from a city called Beersheba. Beersheba in Israel now. It's part of Israel right now. Beer Saba, exactly. So, and during the war of 1948, both my grandparents were killed by Israel when they were very young. Not like my direct grandparents, the father of my grandparents. They were both killed while they were 17. Not 17, I'm not sure about their age, but they both were killed in this war. And then we came to the Gaza Strip. My mother used to live in Rafah, and my father used to live in Gaza. And then they got married, and then we lived in Deir el-Balah for the past 70 years. So this is this is the story of everyone in Gaza or in the West Bank. Every one of them, if you go to the Gaza Strip, if you roam the houses, in every house, you will find someone who lost a brother, who lost a father, who lost a mother, who lost a relative, who lost a loved one. In every house of the Palestinians, we have a story that deserves to be told. And my story is just one of hundreds of thousands of stories. So what we're trying to do in We Are Not Numbers is to raise awareness about these stories, about the origin of the stories. Many people think that the Palestinians have always been living in the West Bank and Gaza. And there is a very big misconception about Palestinians, is that these people came from Gaza and the West Bank. That's not true. Most of the Palestinians, the majority of the Palestinians now came from the cities and the villages that are now in Israel, and they were expelled by force by the Israeli army, the Israeli militias in 1948, and they have been living in refugee camps ever since for the past 70 years.